We started on Sunday and Saturday the book of Daniel, and I want to recap just the beginning and end of Daniel chapter 1. So this is what we read, Daniel 1 in the first few verses here. In the third year of the reign of Jehoiakim, king of Judah, Nebuchadnezzar, king of Babylon, came to Jerusalem and besieged it, and the Lord gave Jehoiakim, king of Judah, into his hands, and some of the vessels of the house of God, and he brought them to the land of Shinar, to the house of his God, and placed the vessels in the treasury of his God. Then the king commanded Ashpenaz, the chief eunuch, to bring some of the people of Israel, both of the royal family and of nobility, youths without blemish, of good appearance and skillful in all wisdom, endowed with knowledge, understanding, learning, and competent to stand in the king's palace, and to teach them the literature and the language of the Chaldeans. The king assigned them a daily portion of the food that the king ate and of the wine that he drank. And they were to be educated for 3 years, and at the end of that time, they were to stand before the king. Among these were Daniel, Hananiah, Mishael, and Azariah of the tribe of Judah, and the chief of the eunuchs gave them names. Daniel he called Belteshazzar, Hananiah he called Shadrach, and Mishael he called Meshach, and Azariah he called Abednego. I'm going to drop down to verse 17. It says this, "And as for these youths, he gave them learning and skill in all literature and wisdom, and Daniel had understanding in all visions and dreams. At the end of the time, when the king had commanded that they should be brought in, the chief of the eunuchs brought them in before Nebuchadnezzar, and the king spoke with them. And among all of them, none was found like Daniel, Hananiah, Mishael, and Azariah. Therefore, they stood before the king, and in every matter of wisdom and understanding about which the king inquired of them, he found them 10 times better than all the magicians and enchanters that were in all his kingdom. And Daniel was there until the first year of King Cyrus." I grew up in church and, was taught a lot of different stories in Sunday school class. And Sunday nights when I was really young, we had whirlybirds where I memorized verses and had a beanie where I earned different little trophies by doing things like learning how to iron or vacuum or things like that, and memorizing scripture. When I got a little bit older, I had jet cadets. And jet cadets was supposed to be the same thing, but all we did was play dodgeball the whole time. And I grew up with a lot of these stories. Daniel had several stories that I heard a lot when I was a young boy growing up in church. You had the story we just read from today, the story of Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego with the fiery furnace, the story of Daniel in the lion's den, amongst others. And for me, for the longest time, these were just stories that, quite frankly, I thought were pretty boring. They just weren't that exciting for me. I also grew up in an age where Harrison Ford was my hero because he was, on one hand, Han Solo, and I got to read adventures or watch adventures about a long time ago in a galaxy that was far, far away, right? And so these space odysseys where he's cowboy / starfighter smuggler. And then at the same time, while those adventures were way out there, I also got to grow up with him being Indiana Jones. And whether it was a Raider in a Lost Ark or in a Temple of Doom, I discovered there were adventures here, not just a way out there. And the Bible passages weren't that exciting for me. As I got older, I started digging in more to the Bible and realized a lot of the stories I grew up with, I didn't understand completely what was being said. about 20 years ago, there was a person that was getting their doctorate, their PhD, and their dissertation, they coined a phrase that is moralistic therapeutic deism, okay? Moralistic therapeutic deism, and this was their point, that in most Christian circles and in most churches, and especially the way we teach children, is that we teach a moralistic religion that's all about right and wrong. Don't do this and do that. The low-hanging fruit would be at a youth group where all you teach the kids is don't drink, don't chew, and don't date girls that do, okay? It's all about just right and wrong. That's moralistic. Therapeutic, it's really about you and your feelings. How are you? There's a God out there who just really cares about you as an individual so much. And, it's all very traumatized and getting into here. So moralistic therapeutic deism, that he's also a God that just really doesn't care a whole lot about us. And, not the type of God that we see in Jesus Christ, okay? Moralistic therapeutic deism. When I got older and started reading the Bible, these stories came to life in ways I had never expected. I began to see a God throughout the Bible that, on one hand, was so much bigger and so much greater than I ever imagined. Much more than just a genie in a bottle or some minor petty God that I would watch in a movie like Clash of the Titans when I was young. This was a God that was above all and beyond all. And he was out there beyond his created universe and spoke it all into existence. And yet he was so much closer and immanent in his creation, a part of us, than I could ever imagine on a day-to-day basis, caring about the smallest things. And I'm saying that because when we look at the book of Daniel, a lot of believers have read through it at different times. If they haven't read the whole thing, it's very popular to study just the first half. And I'll explain that as we get into it. But Daniel is one of those books of the Bible that when you begin to dig into it, layer upon layer, there is so much here that you just don't see right off the top. And so tonight, rather than being expository and digging again through chapter 1, just kind of introduced chapter 1 to us and closed out chapter 1, but want to look at an overview sort of about the book of Daniel and ask some different questions, like who wrote it and when was it written? Want to ask the question, what language is it written in? What is the genre, the structure, and the pattern of the book? And what is the heart, the meat of the book, if you will? What is the meat of the book, the main point? And so let's just go through these questions. First of all, who wrote it and when was it written? The book of Daniel itself claims to be written by who? Daniel, right? Claims to be written by Daniel, a real person who lived in a specific time and place. All right? If you take it just straight at face value, that's what you come up with. And specifically, you get this, like we just read it in Daniel chapter 1, verses 1 and 2. In the 3rd year of the reign of King Jehoiakim, king of Judah, Nebuchadnezzar, king of Babylon, came to Jerusalem and besieged it. And it goes on, talking about the king of Judah, Jehoiakim, and how Nebuchadnezzar took all of the articles out of the temple and brought them to Babylon. That right there, because of those names and those places and the events they surround, seem to ground it within history so that we can begin to see when this book was written. And if that claim is accurate, that it's in the 3rd year of Jehoiakim, and that's when Nebuchadnezzar came, that would be in the year 605 BC. So you think about that, 2,600 years ago, roughly, 2,630 years ago. Absolutely a long time ago, very long time ago. But you look at it, it claims that that's when it was. And even when you go to the end of the book, or the end of chapter 1, we read this. And Daniel was there, meaning in Babylon, until the first year of King Cyrus. We know exactly who King Cyrus is historically. And he started his reign in the year 539, which means this. According to the book of Daniel, it was written by Daniel, tells us a little bit about who he is, that he is from Judah, from Jerusalem. He is of royal blood, and he was a young man, 14 or 15 years old, in the year 605, when he was taken by force from Jerusalem and taken all the way to Babylon, and all the way in the year of Cyrus's first reign, 539, Daniel was still there in that place. Now, you hear me talking about this, and I keep saying, if that's true. Why do I say that? Because amongst a lot of scholars today, they don't think that Daniel was written at that time, and they don't think that Daniel actually wrote the book of Daniel. It's a view that came up recent in history, and by recent, I'm not saying like last year or 10 years ago, but for the last 100, 150 years, there have been scholars that have said that. I want to just process that with you. When you look at a book like Daniel, there's a lot of studies that go into it where people try to line up different dates that are talked about in the Bible to what we know about archaeology and history and try to meld them together. And sometimes they don't seem to fit right at first on face value, okay? They just don't seem to fit. And currently in our culture, we tend to be, as historians, very critical about the past. In the year 2025, we tend to look back to people in the past, and we tend to think that they're not as smart as we are. I mean, you look at how brilliant we are today. The fact that we send people to space, the fact that just yesterday there was a rescue that took place in space, and even in our lifetime, the fact that when we send rockets to space, the boosters don't just fall in the ocean anymore. What do? They fly themselves back to their home. Like, that's crazy, right? That's crazy. And so we tend to think like how smart we are because we have technology that can do that. Ever turned on late at night the TV and you see like a show that's like, man, we can't figure out how they built these pyramids, right? Yeah, they weren't dumb by any means. Their architectural structures are things we still struggle to try to figure out how they did it. There were things that we can do that they couldn't do then, and things that they could do that we don't know how they did it to this day. You think about it, even with a lot of our thoughts, our philosophy, and other things, there's a reason why we have our kids and even college students and even adults go back and study ancient philosophy, ancient theology, read a lot of stuff from dead people. They were just as smart as we are. But what happens often in academia is they look back through critical lenses and they don't take into account what people who lived out events actually say happened. Why? I could go into all kinds of stuff. Whole dissertations and books have been written on this. But to boil it all down to this, people today have a presupposition that they come to the Bible with. A presupposition is an idea or a lens that you already have built in, and when you read certain things, you instantly think of it a certain direction. Consider this, a lot of people today are either extremely conservative or extremely liberal, extremely Republican or extremely Democrat. And have you ever seen somebody look at something and their lens is so one way or the other that they can't honestly look at what's right in front of them? The same thing happens when people read the Bible. If you go to the Bible and your presupposition is that there is no God and miracles do not exist, you come to something like the book of Daniel, and it cannot possibly be written when it was written. Why? Because when we get through Daniel, we're going to read prophecy after prophecy after prophecy that ends up being fulfilled. Most of the prophecies in the book of Daniel in our lifetime have been fulfilled. But in Daniel's lifetime, they weren't. They were prophecies about what would happen in the future. And so many of them took place within a few hundred years of his lifetime that scholars that are antagonistic towards the supernatural, towards miracles, towards anything that have to do with God, come to it with the presupposition to say that is impossible, that somebody could write down all of these different miraculous prophecies that take place. It had to be written hundreds of years later. Someone from Daniel's future, basically, going back under a disguised name, a pseudonym, and saying, I'm Daniel, and here's the prophecies I'm foretelling, but I already know they took place because I'm talking about things in the past. Does that make sense, what I'm saying there? The idea is, from a lot of scholars, that because there are so many prophecies that take place in here, that it has to be somebody writing from a different time period under the pseudonym Daniel. Now, again, it's all presupposition. And to be honest, I come to the Bible with a presupposition. My presupposition is that there is a God. There is more to this world than just this that we can see around us, and that miracles do take place. Why? Because I've experienced them, right? Years ago, we had some friends stay over at our house, and with one of the gentlemen that was at our house, I got to talking with him, and he was someone who grew up in the church, but he became agnostic. Not atheist. He didn't say there is no God. He was agnostic, and he believed we can't know if there's a God. There's not enough evidence. And he started asking me questions about the Bible and about my own personal life and why I believe there is a God. And I showed him mysteries in the Bible, fulfilled prophecies, things from history, archaeology. I talked to him about my own personal life, all the different times I've seen God answer prayer in absolutely miraculous ways. And every time he would just say, that's a very interesting coincidence. Now, for me, there were so many interesting coincidences piled up that I'm like, no, this points to a reality. But he came to it with a critical view. He came to it with a critical view. We looked at the same exact facts and stories and came up with two different answers completely, okay? That's what can take place with the book of Daniel. And to dig even deeper into it, there's a reason why people don't want the book of Daniel to be written when it was written. And when we get to the end of tonight, you'll see why. What do I believe? I believe that the book of Daniel was written by Daniel, and that it was written in the time that it was written in. And out of all the different reasons I could go into that, why do I believe that? Matthew 24:15, Jesus said, "So when you see the abomination of desolation spoken of by the prophet Daniel standing in the holy place, Now, I'm not putting that out as a point to talk about what he's saying in Matthew 24. We will get there at the end of our study of Daniel, weeks from now. I'm bringing this out to point this out. Jesus believed in a real Daniel who was in Babylon when he said, and that he was, in fact, a prophet. So because Jesus believed it, I do as well. I happen to believe in a real Jonah. Why? Because Jesus believed in a real Jonah. I believe in a real Adam and Eve. Why? Because Jesus talked about Adam and Eve. And if you're a believer in Jesus Christ and you put your faith in him and he is your Lord, you should come underneath what he teaches. And that is, these things in the Old Testament truly did happen. Now, that's just the first question. When was it written and who wrote it? Let's see how far we can get into this with the rest of these. What language is it written in? In general, when I ask that question, and as pastors, this is what we normally say to people, is that the Old Testament was written in Hebrew, ancient Hebrew, and the New Testament is written in Koine Greek, a dead language, if you will, okay? It's a dead language, so nobody speaks Koine Greek anymore, except for friends of mine who are really nerdy, okay? And it's not many people that really speak it. But we say Old Testament Hebrew, New Testament Koine Greek. And that is absolutely true, except for when it's not. And Daniel is the one place it's not true, okay? The fascinating thing about the book of Daniel is several chapters of it are actually written in Aramaic. And so we have this. What language is it written in? The first chapter, verse 1, all the way to chapter 2, verse 4, is written in Hebrew. Then from chapter 4, to chapter 7, verse 28, it's all written in Aramaic, which was the language that the Babylonians spoke. And then it switches again at chapter 8 through the end of the book, going back to Hebrew. And even as I say, the book of Daniel was written by Daniel, that is absolutely true, except for the one place that it's not. And it's an amazing chapter that Daniel didn't write. Who wrote it? King Nebuchadnezzar. King Nebuchadnezzar himself tells his own story in this book. Absolutely amazing when you look at it. That just makes it kind of fun if you're into just fun facts. It's written in 2 different languages. This whole middle section of it, big section of it, written in Aramaic, and part of it even by King Nebuchadnezzar himself. Pretty cool when you look at that kind of stuff Bible nerds like to nerd out on. And just low-hanging fruit here. All the way when you get to the time of Jesus and the disciples, what did they speak? People always want to say, well, they spoke Hebrew. No. At that time, first century Jewish people spoke Hebrew when they were in the synagogue a lot of times, but they actually spoke throughout Galilee and that area Aramaic, and then outside of Judah, outside of Israel, they spoke Koine Greek in trade and stuff like that. So a little bit of an interesting fun fact there. What language did Jesus and the disciples, when they were sitting around campfires, speaking? Aramaic. So a little bit about that. And the language piece is going to play into this next question. What is the genre of the book, the structure of the book, and are there patterns in this book? Well, there are 2 main genres in the book of Daniel. Chapters 1 to 6 are a narrative genre. What is a narrative? It's just a story. It's telling a story, all right? So when you look at the book of Genesis, it's a story, a narrative, telling you about creation, telling you about the life of Abraham, Isaac, Jacob, and then Joseph with all of his sons. It's telling you a story. When you go to, 1st and 2nd Samuel, it's a narrative, it's a story about who? Mainly King David, all right? In the New Testament, there are 4 narratives, but we don't call them narratives, we call them gospels: Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John. And then the biggest narrative is the book of Acts. So the first 6 chapters are narrative. And what that means is we're reading just about what took place with Daniel, Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego while they were in Babylon, the stories about them. And that's important to understand because when you look at a narrative story, it's a description, not always a prescription, okay? We can make mistakes a lot of times by looking at narratives and thinking it's just flat out a prescription. Narratives are descriptions of what has gone on in the past. We can learn good things for life from them, and we will, but not all narratives are prescriptions. Low-hanging fruit, the narrative story of Lot and his 2 daughters. Not prescription, description, okay? And if you're like, I don't know that story, tonight, afterwards, if you find Brett and ask him, he can explain that story to you. The last half of Daniel is chapter 7 to 12, and those chapters seem narrative, but what it is it's apocalyptic literature, okay? Apocalyptic literature. In the Bible, 3 books are filled, and there's more in different places, but the 3 big apocalyptic literary passages are the last half of Daniel, Zechariah, and the most famous is what? Revelation. Revelation. Apocalyptic literature. Now, when we hear the term apocalyptic, we think in terms of meteors falling from the sky, doom, destruction, the end of the world. And a lot of times it is talking about that. But the word apocalypso means to be revealed, just to be revealed. And apocalyptic literature is written in dreams and vision, and we see types in them. So when we get to the apocalyptic literature in Daniel, we're going to be reading about all of these big beasts, funky dragons with multiple heads, and leopards with 2 heads, and all these crazy statues and things. Those aren't really describing actual dragons with 7 heads and 10 horns. It's not describing a literal leopard that runs fast and has 8 legs and 2 heads. I mean, that would be some freaky leopard, right? Probably from Wuhan or something. But you look at it, and it's this. It's types. It means something. And here's the incredible thing: if you want to understand Revelation, first understand the apocalyptic imagery in Daniel, because most of the apocalyptic imagery in Daniel has been fulfilled. And we can use those insights then with Revelation on how to actually interpret it. So that's the genre of the book. The structure of the book. Notice I had said 12 chapters of Daniel, that the first half of it is all pretty much narrative, and the second half of it is apocalyptic literature. That would seem on face value the way that the structure is and divides, that you have a book with 2 parts, 2 types of genre, 2 different types of literature, and that the structure of it is that. Not so fast. Not so fast. Because remember that I said it's written in 2 different languages, and the languages don't line up quite accurate with those 2 halves. And there's something deeper inside of the book of Daniel that you tend to not see just at face value. The way that we're going to be studying Daniel and the way that I outline and divide this book up isn't chapters 1 through 6 and chapters 7 through 12. It's this. Chapter 1, the prologue, okay? And even on Sunday, that was the title. Be Resolute, the prologue. That was the title of last weekend's sermon. Then chapters 2 through 7, the Aramaic passages all go together, and chapters 8 to 12, the Hebrew passages all go together, okay? And we're breaking it down that way. Why? Chiasm. Chiasm. Look at the person next to you and say that while I get some tea really fast. What is a chiasm? A chiasm is a literary structure that we don't use a lot in our culture, but ancient cultures used it all the time. The Odyssey and the Iliad are full of chiasms, okay? Ancient peoples use them all the time. And it's a literary structure where you have a story with a beginning and the end, and the beginning and the end are parallel. And then if you look at the beginning of the story to the next section of the story, and you look at the second to last section of the story, they're parallel. And then if you go to the third section of the story and look at the third to last section of the story, those are parallel. And then somewhere in the middle, you have something that stands all on its own. That's a chiasm. Or you could think of it this way. When I was a kid, my dad one time for dinner made us hamburgers, okay? And we're there eating our hamburgers. I grew up, my mom and dad, myself, and two people that they said were my siblings, but there's no way that I'm related to them. We were there having hamburgers, and my sister the whole time just kept saying, "Dad, this hamburger is incredible. This is the most incredible hamburger I have ever had in my life." And she was just raving about it. And we got most of the way done. Most of us were probably about 2/3 of the way done with our dinner. And my dad looked over at the plate of where the hamburger patties were, and there was a hamburger patty sitting there. And he said, "Who didn't get a hamburger?" And we were all like, "We all have hamburgers." And he's like, "No, there's 5 of us. I made 5 patties. There's 1 patty sitting there." Lo and behold, the best hamburger in the world my sister ever had. She forgot to put the patty in it, right? So it's like, is it actually a hamburger without the ground beef inside? No. That's what makes it a hamburger, right? Is that in the middle? That's the point. That's what a chiasm is in literary form. And you can look at it. Chapter 1, different scholars will say chapter 1 is a chiasm, and I can kind of see it. It wasn't until today where it started to mold together, but you look at it, like easy things in chapter 1. If you notice, chapter 1 starts out with the reign of a king and ends with the reign of a king. And there's different structures in there. You can look, and you get to more the center. It's off just a little bit, but is that Daniel resolved in his heart not to defile the Lord. The main part of that chapter, okay? When you look at this whole thing, 2 large chiasms appear. One in Aramaic, one in Hebrew. So we're not talking like one chapter. We're talking multiple chapters, and the themes of those chapters go together. So the first one, chapter 2 and 7, are parallel to each other. Chapter 3 and 6 are parallel to each other. And you look then at 4 and 5 are parallel. And it does it in the last half of the book with the Hebrew sections. So if that's the case, the question is, what is the center of the Aramaic section? And what is the center of the Hebrew section? And if we figure that out, it tells us what Daniel is trying to communicate to us. what the main point. So on the Aramaic section, and this is just insight. We're going to get there in a few weeks when we study through Daniel, but you guys are just getting a jump start on this, okay? When we get to chapter 4, verse 37, it's the passage where Nebuchadnezzar is writing himself. Verse 34, it's the center. Now I, Nebuchadnezzar, praise and extol and honor the King of heavens, for all his works are right, and his ways are just, and those who walk in pride, he is able to humble. The center of the Aramaic section is King Nebuchadnezzar submitting himself to God. Okay? How does the whole story of Daniel start? Nebuchadnezzar goes and conquers God's holy city. He goes to the temple of worship. He steals all of the utensils of worship and goes and puts them in the temple of his God, trying to make Yahweh, the God of the Hebrew people, subordinate to him. And in the center of this whole section is a Gentile king coming to the point where he knows there is one true God who is over all. That's the message of the first half right there. And I would say that's the message to us because probably the vast majority, if not all of us here, are Gentiles. There is one king who is greater than all. He's the King of the Jews. He is Yahweh. And what is at the center of the Hebrew section? Oh, can't wait to get to this one. We're going to have to do this one on a Wednesday night, because it's very heady. But Daniel chapter 9 with his prophecy, the prophecy of his weeks, okay? And it's apocalyptic. If you look at it, there's a prophecy in Daniel where if Daniel was written by Daniel, when it says it was written, and you look at the prophecy, it tells you exactly when the Messiah will come, and it points to the fact that Jesus Christ is that Messiah. Daniel 9:26. After the 62 weeks, an anointed one, that's the word Messiah or Christ, shall be cut off and shall have nothing. And I'm going to show you when we get there exactly what that points to. And it's proof that Jesus Christ is the prophesied Messiah. Why do people want to say it's not written when it was written? Because it points directly to Christ. And if you accept this for what it is, you have to, like Nebuchadnezzar, submit yourself and humble yourself before the God of all creation.